This is a Your Farm Business podcast with Mike Krause of P2P Agri. G'day and welcome back to another episode of the Your Farm Business podcast, brought to you by P2P Agri. My name is Tom Moir and I'm the host of this episode today, and we're joined again by Mike Krause, the founder and CEO of P2P Agri. Welcome back, Mike.
Good to be back, Tom, and good to catch some time with you.
So, Mike, we've talked a bit about the software side of P2P Agri and your own background and training and all these other interesting aspects. We're going to just jump into a bit of a side quest or a side lane here for this conversation today to talk about something that may not have actually been at the forefront of your mind. It may have been, but it may not have been when you started out on the P2P Agri quest yourself in delivering that service to farmers. But it's something that I think every farmer does encounter at some point in their lives. And so we're talking about succession planning today. And I'm very curious as to how you came into this space. What kind of drew you into that space to bring you where you are now?
Good question, Tom. I guess I started my own consulting practice about 30 years ago. My background is an agricultural economist, so I'm coming from a numbers perspective, and I'd help farmers with different questions they had for me about purchasing land, changing farming systems. But as you get closer to farmers and you get to talk to them, they'll share with you other challenges and issues they're going through. And a couple of my clients said, oh, look, succession planning hasn't happened or should happen, or we haven't got around to it, or that sort of thing. How do we go about it, doing it, Mike, and should we do it? And then I sort of looked around at some examples around the place of people that had gone through it, and some of them were disastrous. And I'm thinking, there must be good ways and bad ways of doing this. So one of the clients did ask me, said, would you help us go through succession planning? And I said, okay, as any good consultant would do, I don't say no to any question or challenge. So I'll say, okay, look, I'll help you out doing it. But Tom, it was like someone gave me a Christmas present and you've got it, you're really excited, it's all wrapped up. And then you unwrap the Christmas present and you think, holy hell, what have I said yes to? Because you never know what's in the room when you get there. And I've probably helped, 20 farming families work through it. Some levels of success and some levels of disaster. I kind of hope it wasn't because of me the disaster happened, but it's all to do about family dynamics, family expectations, openness and honesty, or the lack of, that can bring this process asunder. But to me, it's one of the biggest elephants in the room, or one of the biggest risks that farm families have to confront and manage, so that we can get our objective of getting the land from one generation to the next generation as effectively and usefully as we can, not forgetting that, you might be the fourth generation on the farm or the third generation on the farm. So the farm has done it already, whether it's been good or bad, but it's a process that all farming families, and 95% of our farmers in Australia are farming families. So it's not a one-off issue, it's not an uncommon issue, but I think there are good principles to follow to help us work through it.
And so from your experience with it then, Mike, why do you think it is such a difficult conversation to have for those farming families? What makes it such a difficult thing that keeps it being a white elephant in the room?
It's about management and control, Tom. The older generation may not ever want to get to the situation where they want to relinquish the wealth and management of the business, or they do want to do that and the next generation aren't quite sure whether they want to take over from mum and dad. There's a lot of assumptions in the process of farming families as they grow up, and if those assumptions aren't challenged or talked through, they may not be correct, or they may be correct. We've got to really challenge those. And I think it's probably the hardest thing is that we really need to get an environment where there's good, open, clear, and honest communication happening. And sometimes that's very difficult for a family to do without a third party facilitating it. And it's getting that third party to facilitate, I think, is one of the very, very important aspects of succession planning. Because I've come in a couple of times where the facilitator is really combative and having people fighting against each other, thinking that's where we're going to get the solutions coming out. And it's like they've grabbed the hand grenade, pulled the pin out, gone to the family desk or dinner table that everyone's meeting around and dropping the hand grenade in the middle of it and walking away. It's just
Mm.
made things worse. So I think it's more that open communication, respect for each other, maybe love for each other, that we want to work out what the best solution is going to happen here.
And so, on the other side of that coin, what are the sort of risks and mistakes that you see that farmers make when they delay succession planning? So, when they just keep putting it off, going, oh, we'll get to this one day. What are some of the things or patterns? I guess so you're a data man, you like analytics. So, what are some of the patterns that you see come through?
Oh, look, the worst situation I found, I was working with a farming family, and son had been working home for about 10 years helping dad on the family farm. And uns- well, he had actually 11 sisters and brothers, so he was one of 12. But he was the one that came home to help dad with the farm. And he always assumed that he was getting the farm. But when dad passed away and the will was read, the idea is that we're going to be absolutely equal here and everyone's going to get a piece of the pie. So his farming future ended on the reading of the will. Whether that was dad's intention, I don't know. But that's to me the worst outcome, where a son has dedicated 10 years of life to helping dad in the farm and is not being rewarded any differently to his siblings when the will's read out. So that's probably the worst case scenario. Other case scenarios are where expectations of the next generation are different, and it's not really expressed to mum and dad, or mum and dad think, hang on, this farm isn't really viable if we give it to Johnny, Jennifer and Jack, the three of them, which should only probably go to Johnny, but how are we going to reward the others? And that's, to me, is where you come back that we need to be fair with our succession. We may not be able to be equal if our objective is for this family business to continue on farming in the next generation. So that's an interesting concept, to be fair. So little Johnny and little Julie don't miss out, but we may not be equal in dividing the wealth up.
That's a really, really great point. I think you could probably unpack that, and there's a there's a lot that could go into working that into different situations. But how does the emotional, I guess, the more familial and emotional aspects, and the farm is often the home as well, but the farm is also the business. So you've got sometimes
Mm.
people have very strong emotional connections, or they might even have just historical connections, wanting to continue the legacy and that sort of thing. But it's still also functionally a business. And so how does that relationship, it's very complex trying to work out what's fair and what's just in that situation.
You're correct, Tom. I guess the way I've conducted family meetings is that mum and dad, I'll sit on the phone and actually talk to mum and dad and say, what if I was your fairy godmother and we waved the magic wand and we're 10 years down the track, how do you see the farm being managed then, and who's going to be managing it, and what's your plans and objectives? I'll do that on the phone, and that'll give me a list of agenda items, if you like. This is okay, we've got to talk about this. Then I'll go to little Johnny and I'll do the same and say, look, you've been working on the farm, succession planning, what do you think that will mean for you? How would you like to see it? And we then get some agenda items, and I'll also ask them what the elephant in the room for them is. So me as a facilitator, my job is to raise the elephant in the room issues, so that little Johnny doesn't get picked on and say, oh, Johnny, you shouldn't have raised that. That was too close to the core. And I'll do the same for every child in the farming business before we come and meet around the table for the first time. And then when we meet around the table the first time, I'll ask everyone to come be patient and listen and respect each other. I, as a facilitator, is here to stop Tom dominating discussions, so Tom can contribute, but I'm not going to let him take over everything because we're going to have different personalities in the room. But our objective really is to help mum and dad achieve their goals, and then from that, as the next generation, how do we blend into that? Now, I've had instances where little Johnny and little Jenny aren't going to be farmers and don't want to be part of the farming business, but they don't want to lose access to it because the creek or the hill out the back, we used to go camping as kids, and we want our kids to experience that. So, we negotiate access to the land still, even though they might not own it or farm it, so that they're not losing that emotional connection, and their kids can have that emotional connection happening too. And we try and separate that away from the business of farming. So it depends, it's horses for courses, and it comes through being, as a facilitator, actively listening to everyone's ideals and objectives and what they're trying to achieve. We may not be able to achieve everything, but really it's mum and dad's prime, they're the ones that hold the purse strings, so it's what they're trying to achieve probably drives the rest of the discussion.
Mm. I think the grenade example is a very very poignant one that paints a good image of how things can go badly. And I think from your experience and definitely from people I've spoken to before, the general expectation is that they are difficult and that they don't often go well. You do hear good studies, like good case examples where people say, no, we did it early, it went really well, everything's been effective. But I think most people just kind of go, oh, no, not succession again. So, from your point of view, what does good succession planning and practice look like?
Okay, probably the ideal, the textbook one would, like you said, Tom, start early and do it often. So little Tom's at 5 years old, I can tell whether he likes to get on the ute with dad and go out in the paddock, or whether he'd rather stay in playing his Nintendo games in the lounge room. So have that discussion early and try and understand what the next generation is after. But to me, it's a process of planning and then reviewing and then executing. And it's not, if you start doing it early, it should be part of a system of the planning process in the farm. What we've decided 10 years ago may not be pertinent this year because, I don't know, one of the kids have divorced, or one of the other kids have had 3 kids in that time. And so there's more need for us to plan this through, but have that sort of process happening that we perhaps come and revisit it. This is our plan we set up 10 years ago. Yes, Tom's going to come home and yep, we're going to hand over the management when Tom gets to 25, and then we'll look at handing over the assets when Tom gets to 35 or 40. I guess that's the other thing in succession planning, is we don't necessarily have to hand the management over and the assets over at the same time. And always, I thought there was a good rule of thumb that if Tom was taking over the farm, then he should get some element of the checkbook before he gets to 30. So then he knows when he's writing out that $60,000 check for elders for superphosphate or fertilizer, that he knows he's writing 60 grand with the idea we're going to get 300 grand coming back in grain sales and those sort of things. So understands what it's like to take risk and be a business person, rather than Tom getting the checkbook when he's 65 because he's had a career of farming and being a worker. So suddenly he's got to be a manager, and that becomes all a bit too hard. So really, to me, it's about putting the plan together, reviewing it regularly, executing elements of that plan, and then come back and review it. If people haven't done that, and it's really come to the stage where dad and mum have gotten into their 70s and they physically don't really want to be farming like they have been, well, then we might have a series of meetings where, to me, like I said, we set the agenda out, we talk about those different gender items. Some of them we'll agree to. as individuals or as collective, as a family. Some of them we may not have agreed to, or we may not have enough information. We might have to go off and talk to the accountant about tax implications of capital gain. We might have to go and talk to the banker, like how do we redraw up the loan so that Tom can take over the business rather than Dad keeping the liabilities of that. So we go away, do our homework, come back to the next meeting. Yes, we've ticked off half the agenda. The rest of the agenda will talk. And it might take 3 or 4 meetings until we've finally ticked all those elements off. And that's given an overview plan, which includes when things are going to happen and how mum and dad are going to be looked after financially. Are they going to be living in their normal family farm, or are they shifting to the local town, and the normal family farm then becomes the occupants of the next generation, and those sort of things. So it's sort of, I guess it's a process for me. It's hard to give a recipe to say this is exactly how it's going to happen in each family meeting that we do.
No, well, it would be so specific to those different circumstances, how many kids are involved, and yeah, just so many variables. In terms of if, say, the farmers haven't done any preparation at all, so they haven't done any succession planning, they haven't started early, which would be ideal. How do they start? Like, what's your advice on practical tips for them to start that process? Because I'm assuming that if it has been delayed for a long time, it's probably quite a difficult thing to do. So, what's the best place to start that process?
Good question, Tom. To me, the best place to start is mum and dad are ready. So even though Tom's parents know succession planning is coming, but if they're not ready to talk about it and Tom is, well, it's going to be hard. It's going to be like pushing water up a hill. But if mum and dad are ready, that's the first box we've got to tick. And if they're ready, then I'd strongly suggest they look for a third party who would then start to facilitate a process so they can bring the family together. Because if they're in their 70s and they really haven't spoken to their kids yet, well, there's obviously a few elephants in the room that are stopping this to happen. So if that's the case, then we need a third party to help manage those elephants in the room, identify them first, and then work through so that we can get solutions to that. And in doing that, I guess from my background, I tend to be a facilitator where I'd rather listen to the issues that are going on around the table, ask the hard questions, and try and elicit the answers. Now, I know of a few accountants and I know of a few lawyers who don't have that process at all. They'll come in and say, righto, this is how I think it should do, so I'm going to force my impressions of what you should do, so I'm going to get my round peg and shove it into a square hole, and this is what is going to happen. And even if you go to a lawyer, lawyers tend to be combative. So they're saying, okay, I'll come in and do it, but I can only represent mum and dad. I can't represent Tom, so Tom will have to get his own lawyer. So you'll end up getting two lawyers building heads against each other to try and get a result out. Now, to me, that's very aggressive, and it's really hard to develop an environment where the family owns the solution. You're going to get one or two parties that'll own that solution. The other parties will be dragged in screaming, and sure as eggs, it's not necessarily going to be a long-term solution. So perhaps to answer that question, see if you can get someone with a wise head who is a better listener than speaker to help facilitate that process.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Listening. I think it may have been you in a previous episode, or we may have just been chatting, but that thing came up about we've got one mouth and two ears, and so it should be that ratio.
Exactly. So any facilitator of that sort of difficult process, and I'm not saying that process works all the time. I can give you examples where it all fell apart. And I'm thinking, oh, okay. And I've had people standing up, screaming, swearing both at me and mum and dad as they walk out the room, never to return. But my point was really that was going to happen anyway. Let's
Mm.
just ask the question and get it over and done with, and then work out how we're going to deal with this later.
Yeah. No, no, no.
Mm.
It's certainly a tricky situation at the best of times. Bringing in the P2P Agri side of things, the data analysis and number crunching, all those sorts of things. that obviously has to play an element in the succession planning as well, because if you did get the accountant in, or even talk to the bank about it and said, hey, we're looking at doing succession planning and this is the thing, then they would be looking at the numbers, they'd be looking at the profit, they'd be looking at the feasibility of the whole operation. So have you found that the software that you've got and all the data you're able to collect, being able to fall back on that, can you probably can't run an exact model on, oh, if we run the succession this way through the software, but it must provide you with some good data that can help make that decision.
No, and that's probably what's attracted me to come in to do a bit more succession planning, Tom, is that I find that element of financial planning missing in a lot of succession planning activities. So
Mm.
even though mum and dad might know what their business has done, when Tom comes in and has got to take over some loans from mum and dad, and he might have to take over some more loans to pay little Johnny and little Julie out with, that business will look quite a bit different than what mum and dad's was. So Tom's got to be happy that that's the level of risk he's about to walk into, and he's happy to do it. So our software and the scenario analysis side of things really helps a lot to give Tom a view of what that business would look like. At the same time, giving mum and dad a view of where the business has come from and where it's sitting at the moment, and can we fund financial independence from them to go forward. One classic example, I have helped this farming family. We came through together probably 20 years ago, and Dad said, no, the two boys, yes, you both want to go farming. We're going to stay together. We'll shift and we'll go to the local town, and you guys will keep farming together. And I did the modelling, and in that case, they wanted to get access to Centrelink's uh, sort of the pension,
Oh,
but mum and dad have to then get rid of their assets for five
yes.
years before that happens. So we did all the modelling and said, yes, okay, we can do this way. And yes, that's the process that mum and dad did. And they actually achieved that. But then 10 years later, the boys came back to me and they said, we know that dad and mum don't think we can survive economically apart, but if we keep farming together where we are, we're going to kill each other. So I grabbed again the software and said, righto, what if we split it up? And the two boys were quite, they weren't, what I say, ownership of any particular parcel of land. They decided who was going to get what. So that was the easy part. And then I modelled little Johnny's farm and said, righto, this is the debt you're going to take on and this is what it's going to be. And little Jeffrey's farm, I modelled that and then handed it back to them and said, righto, is this a risk you want to take? And they both said yes. And it looked like both would be viable. So then we had to go back to mum and dad, because 10 years earlier they wanted the farm to be farmed by both the boys, and say, look, we've done modelling. Mike's helped us to do the modelling. Are you okay if we split the farm up? And that's what we did probably 8 years ago. And as far as I know, the last time I spoke to them, they're different directions. They're both very happy. Do they talk to each other? Probably not. But I guess in the end of the day, mum and dad should be congratulated because they actually had two boys that could go off and go farming.
Yeah, fantastic. And that was the outcome, even though it looked a bit different to what they envisioned, but still there. If they're both on the
Mm,
land and they're both farming, then that's a really, really good outcome. Um,
yeah.
if you could give, um, yeah, if you could give a piece of advice to families in this situation who they might be already in that situation or they're about to start that process, what advice would you give to them from all your experience?
Okay. Well, first of all, um, it's hard, but you can pick your friends, you can't pick your family. And we've been brought up in a family environment where there may have been, arguments that weren't repaired or relationships that fell apart. What I'd say is go in with your eyes open. Can we solve all the risks? Some of the elephants in the room could be, little Johnny, we were going to pass the land over, but he got married, and then 5 years later, that divorce happened, and we nearly lost the farm. So how are we going to do that again if little Johnny finds another wife and comes together? So it's it's always that elephant to say, how do we manage the risk of that happening. Now, that could be on one side of the fence. The other side of the fence is the risk of the will's been read out. So, mum and dad's will's written up and Tom's going to take over the land, but his two brother and sister aren't going to, and where the will said all the land's going to Tom. Well, the brother and sister might say, well, yeah, okay, we thought that was going to happen, but their husband and wife said, hang on, there's a lot of wealth there going to Tom. We could probably have a part of that action because we've got a big mortgage back in Perth or Adelaide or Melbourne or Sydney. We could pay that off with that. And so they'll contest the will, and generally contested wills will be divided equally. So little Tom has lost the opportunity to be farming because the courts have said, no, we're going to divide it equally. So if we want to stop that risk happening, Tom's dad and mum should have passed the assets over to Tom before the will is read out. So there's no assets to be contested in the will. So there's those elements have to be worked through. Plus also don't ignore the financial modelling. Now some farmers say, I don't want to farm, I want to pass the farm on to Tom with no debt. And I've seen that before, but the farm has been passed on to Tom. It's too small. Its ability to buy and continue to get bigger is really restricted. So having the attitude where we pass the farm on to Tom with debt is not a bad thing as long as the farm has kept its size up. So economically, it's still sustainable and still a good platform for further growth. So there's a few little strategies that should be talked through the process. And that's why I encourage people to start early rather than starting later, because it gives you much more options to manage the dynamics and manage if we want the farm to go on to the next generation.
Yeah, and so interesting because things like when you mentioned about the pension, that can take 5 years of planning. You can't just sort of say, oh, we need to do succession planning now and make changes right now. Well, 5 years ago to equal that equation in particular. So yeah, it does that. Foresight's really important. Something else that's interesting, Mike, in terms of the land size, because that seems quite common. Just split the place down the middle and try and make it fair as much as possible between however many parties are concerned. But something I find interesting is that often the accountant will come in and say, oh, you can't split the place. I'll look at the portfolio now. And they'll say, oh, if you split it, it becomes economically unviable based off what you're currently doing. But what I find interesting is that oftentimes if you do split the place up, someone's going to sell anyway. If it's let's say it's a couple thousand acres and it gets split up and there might be just 800 acres go up for sale. Someone with a farming mind will look at that 800 acres and go, I can make that profitable. We can run a business on that 800 acres. Whereas the accountant previously will look at that same thing and say, no, that's not going to be viable. The farm's just going to evaporate and you'll have to sell it off. And to my mind, the only key difference there is management. So it kind of comes down to what do you see in the land? What do you see in the business? What can be done with it? But the accountant, if he's working with the family that's there and been there for a long time and knows their numbers, knows their books and knows how it works, yes, it probably is unviable if you do split it in half. But it's more to do with the management and less to do with the land. So things at scale become really interesting, I think, when you get to those numbers.
Look, it is too, Tom, and just bear in mind, I'm not taking away the skills of the accountants. I mean, they do a brilliant job in help minimising tax, but they generally only look from the business from what's happened to the profit and loss from a tax perspective and the balance sheet. That, like you've just said, the future vision of the next generation might be very different. You might say, no, I'm not going to do sheep and grain anymore. I'm going to become more of a pasture chicken egg producer, or I might move into another industry which is more intensive, and the asset that I'm inheriting might be perfect for that. Well, that's great. And so unless the accountant does that modeling of moving into the different industry and seeing what's going to do for the next generation, and they generally don't, and it's probably the responsibility of the next generation to have some good ideas together so that we can financially model as saying, okay, mum and dad are farming 3,000 acres and I'm only going to get 1,500 of that. Well, if I turn that over to a egg producing business, what does that look like? and what assets does that require to build up, and will that be viable? A lot of that modelling isn't done, and that's where I'm suggesting it should be done, and it helps then clarify those decisions going forward. Rather than that other example I gave you, where 20 years ago, Dad and Mum said, no, 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 boys, we've got to farm together.
Mm.
Well, the evolution was that they were moving from grain production to hay production, and that actually further improved the profitability of the business and allowed them to split it up. So your point is well made, and some accountants don't go down that path as far as they should.
But I think it also highlights the benefits of being able to model those different scenarios as well. Just whether it is the chickens or whatever it may happen to be, being able to actually punch the
Mm,
numbers in and say, okay, well, if this is what we are potentially working with, can it work under the
mm,
current system? No. Okay. What conditions could it work under? So I'll just, yeah,
mm,
incredibly beneficial to be able to run that. Just one other
mm,
question I had for you, Mike. This has come up before from people that I've spoken to when there's a few kids involved, and normal scenario where one of them or two of them may want to stay on and the others are not so interested, but they do want a slice of the pie. And there seems to be different ways to approach that. The fair thing might be to split it up and they each get a part of it. But if you want to maintain the business and the farm itself, and people get to come back and bring their kids back to the little creek and the hill, very, very important. So, have you come across some ways that are successful where there are maybe multiple parties involved, where it doesn't mean that the one that stays on the farm has to work and work and work with that burden, I guess they would say, of having to pay out the siblings? Because I know of quite a few people in that exact situation where they're having to pay out their siblings and they're having to constantly bring in money that's not theirs to keep because it's just this cycling debt, and then eventually the land itself can become a real burden to be there, and they themselves get tired after a period of time. So in that scenario, what have you found works well?
Look, there's a number of different strategies that people can use there, Tom, and it depends how early they start thinking about this. Like it could be, we've gone back 20 years in your case, and you've had no interest really in the farm. You'd rather play computer games at home, and Mum and Dad said, righto, Tom, you're not going to be a farmer. I'm going to actually send you to Perth to boarding school, and let's educate you in a profession. You might end up being an accountant or a finance person or a teacher or a doctor or some other things like that. And that investment in your education could be seen as investing in your future. And we know Tom's not going to come home on the farm, but we've helped to set him up in a career that he can now go off, make his decisions, and travel the world if he wants to. So don't discount saying some kids, if you've helped them to go through, university, secondary education, and that sort of stuff, is part of the benefit that they've received. That's one strategy I've seen used. Another strategy I've seen used is saying, righto, that last parcel of land that we bought, I know Tom's not coming back, but let's put it in his name so it's an asset for him. So Tom knows he's got one asset there, but it's not an asset that's going to be sold anytime soon. The remaining next generation on the farm might be asked to lease it back. So that lease payment goes into Tom's income activity. So he can use that. He could use that asset to borrow against if he wants to buy a house in a capital city in his state and things like that. So they can use that building forward. I've had other examples where additional loans have been taken out. So Tom, you want to take over the farm, that's fine. You get all the land, but we want 200 grand's got to go to Jenny because she is our daughter and we want her to benefit from it. We don't have 200 grand now, but let's take out a loan and that becomes your liability, Tom. As long as the farm is still viable and not anchored down like the other example you were just sharing, and then you're responsible for paying that debt off. Little Jenny gets the 200 grand and that goes to deposit in a house in Perth or Adelaide or Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or something like that. So there's different strategies, and I guess to me is if the farm's antenna is tied into that early, then we can explore all those strategies, and we can even ask the neighbours to see how they've handled it and how they've gone through it and what's worked and what hasn't worked. It's where fathers particularly make decisions independent of their wives, independent of their kids, and we only find out, the will read out, no one's really talked about it, and as a result, the family's split up, the kids don't want to talk to each other, and it's just ends in a nightmare, really.
Yeah. And so have you used your software to help run models for people in this situation? Have you helped people going through succession planning to look at what their options might be?
Yeah. Every time I help farming families do that, I see as part of my responsibility to model what the likely outcome is for the next generation who are taking over the farm. And you'd appreciate that. There's so many permutations that you've really got to tailor it to each particular farm's environment and particular characteristics, and then have it on the table and people, even if you're taking over, Tom, then you can say, yeah, no, that risk is too high. I don't think I want that. At least you can make that decision now rather than Tom's taking over. We haven't done the analysis, but in 10 years' time, it's too much of a burden and we just got to close things down. And you've gone through 10 years of angst thinking, oh, we're going to get out of this hole, but you haven't. So we can make those decisions earlier. It's better for everyone involved. But yes, you're right. The software that we use helps to model from that picture that we talked about earlier, from an efficiency, from a cash flow perspective, and also a wealth generation perspective.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, Mike. Well, look, it's been really, really great to talk to you about succession planning in this episode because it's not what you set out to do, probably by any means. It just happened to be an accidental craft that came up there on the side. It was shared knowledge base and shared skill area. So, yeah, really great to get your insights in that. So, yeah, thank you very much.
No worries, Tom, and I hope it's benefited from those who are listening, those who are thinking about succession planning. Start to do it now. I know you can always put it on the shelf and leave it till next year or the year after, but your options are getting more limiting if you do that.
Thanks for listening to the Your Farm Business podcast. For more information or to get in contact with Mike, simply search for p2pagri.com.au.